Hello, I'm Jack from Shure, and I'm here today to talk to you about the 7 family is what we're describing this as now. So this is the MV7X, the MV7 and the SM7B. Now, I reckon if you're watching this video, you probably recognize and perhaps are even here because of this microphone to my right, which is the SM7B. Now, the concept of this at the time, when we released it in the 1980s, was to go after the broadcast sound market. And microphones at that time used in that marketplace generally were condenser microphones. And condenser microphones are fantastic, but they have quite a lot of active electronics in them in order to get the sound working, right? They are an active microphone. And that means that they can generate quite a lot of self-noise. So good condenser microphones at the time with really low self-noise had to have very expensive components, and that made them very expensive. And the thought process was, could we take the technology that was doing really well in the SM58 and the SM57 with that Unidyne 3 dynamic coil and essentially do a souped up version to make it sound as good as it can possibly be? And that is what we ended up with the SM7B. It turned into an incredibly sensitive dynamic microphone, so you got all of that top-end detail, but gave you all of the advantages that a dynamic microphone brings. So there's virtually no noise in this. In fact, the only real noise that it generates is the thermal noise from the coil moving itself. Now, we released this in the 80s and we were very excited about it. Unfortunately, the market wasn't ready. Everyone was very into the condenser workflow at that time and didn't want to take a punt on something like this. It also had a couple of idiosyncrasies that made it slightly more challenging to use. For example, you had to be right up close to the coil of this. You had to be speaking directly into the front of it in order to make it work properly. You had to be really up close to it due to the amount of impedance that is in that circuit to get that super low noise but high output performance working properly. So if you had it far away from you, it was just way too quiet and didn't work. You also needed a good preamp to drive it properly for the same reason. So you either needed some sort of inline FET-based preamp or a really strong preamp on the desk with a good, amount of gain into it with not a lot of noise to get it running. So therefore in the 80s, it didn't do tremendously well and it kind of sat in the portfolio for a number of years until it started to get picked up by people doing podcasting, and specifically people who wanted to self-produce podcasts at home or in industrial estates that they were doing engineering in themselves or something of that nature. And the reason why it became so popular was, unlike a condenser microphone where you pick up the sound of the room that you're in, a big advantage of dynamic coils is that it just picks up the thing that it is pointing at. That's it. You get very, very little room noise in a microphone like this. So this became an absolute favorite of that industry, particularly people wanting to podcast from home. But we started to notice that users were encountering some problems that we saw happen when we initially released this in the 80s. So people were plugging this into audio interfaces, for example, that just didn't have enough gain in them to make it work properly. And that meant that there was a lot of noise coming into the system from the cheaper audio interface that was making their audio sound bad. The other problem that we started to see when this was used for gaming applications was game streamers wanting to have it quite far away. And you need to get right up on top of this microphone to make it sound good, to get that good dynamic range. So what Shure decided to do was take what makes this an excellent microphone and an industry standard and build in some extra features that solve those problems and bring the price down a little bit, because it's an expensive piece of equipment. And so we released the MV7, which is the microphone that is in the center here. This again has a dynamic coil in it. The coil that we ended up using has what we have decided to call voice isolation technology. In essence, it's a very, very consistent cardioid polar pattern. What does that mean? Well, polar patterns can change depending on how low or how high the frequency going into them is. So a really low sound at 20,000 hertz, for example, that cardioid polar pattern starts to distort and you get a big hotspot out the back and a big hotspot out the sides. And the same for really high frequencies as well. Up at 20,000, it does all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So this particular voice coil that we've used, we selected because that cardioid polar pattern is pretty much bang on consistent all throughout that frequency spectrum. So again, if you are recording in a space that is not acoustically sound and you've got a lot of HF rolling around that you want to get rid of, when you point this at your face or whoever's face that you are trying to record, it is just going to record that audio. You're not going to get the noise from the walls or from anything else or from the digger that's outside or from the person upstairs doing the hoovering. It laser focuses in and just picks up your audio. So still a dynamic voice coil, and then we've got a couple of things that make it suitable for modern podcasting and gaming applications. So with the MV7 we have a USB audio interface built into the back of this, and that actually drives a bit of dynamic signal processing as well in order for us to do some quite clever things. We can change how this coil sounds. We can make it sound brighter if we want a more modern sound, or we can make it sound a bit darker if we want the more traditional SM7B sound. The DSP that's been engineered into this that the team in Chicago have done essentially is a bit of witchcraft in my opinion, because it also has the ability to be used at a distance. You can set this to be a microphone that's far away and it sounds like it's right up in front of your face and still rejects everything else. It's very, very clever. But we didn't want to just make it a USB-based device, so we put an analog XLR out on the back of it as well. And the big advantage of having this setup was if you are doing a podcast at home where you need to do a video call on a Zoom or a Teams or something like that, you can use the USB interface for the Teams call so that your interviewee has good audio. And you can use the analog XLR out the back into a local recorder, a Zoom recorder, a Focusrite recorder, something like that, and then you capture perfect audio without the video conferencing software compressing or doing any weird EQ or any weird kind of isolating stuff that it likes to do to your audio, and make it sound as professional as it can possibly be. So we released this and it's done incredibly well, but we have now seen a new type of user pop up who wants to use many of these devices at the same time. And if you try and plug 4 or 5 of these into one laptop, it can get a little bit confused as to where the USB routing is going. So we wanted to bring something to market that has that voice isolating coil, that laser focused sound, but doesn't have the DSP in the back of it, just has the XLR. And that's where we get to the MV7X. X standing for XLR. Now you can use this like any normal dynamic microphone. It sounds very, very similar to analog SM7B, so with just XLR coming out the back of it, but it requires less gain, so you can use it with cheaper audio interfaces and still get excellent results. But because we've got that voice isolating coil, it pulls the same trick that the MV7 does and just focuses on your voice without any of the other sounds that are going on in the room. And that's the range. Many people are still opting to go for the SM7B and buying devices like FET-based preamps, cloud lifters, things of that nature in order to get them sounding good. And you won't find a better sounding dynamic microphone if that's the way that you go. But if you don't want to spend SM7B money and you want to have excellent dynamic sound with low noise and a huge dynamic range, then there are 2 options here for you to choose from, one with a USB interface and one without. So I hope that's been a useful video for you. If you've got any questions, you can visit the Gear for Music website where all 3 of these products have got the full product specifications, details, and pricing available for you as well.